What's going on in Tourette's? So only about 25% of people with Tourette syndrome suffer from coprolalia as a symptom. And that depends on how it's defined as well, whether it's sort of intermittent desires to swear or whether swearing has become this ingrained tic. But largely, so there's two answers. One is it's not always swearing. So there's one guy who is part of a medical case study whose vocal tic was to want to call his girlfriend the name of his ex during sex.
Yeah.
And it is, when you study people with Tourette syndrome, all kinds of really interesting things are going on with the neurochemistry. So dopamine, neurotransmitter, is distributed through, there are dopamine receptors in your liver. We don't know like 0.1% of what dopamine actually does, but we do know that something is happening with dopamine in Tourette syndrome, and it's possibly an overstimulated reward system, something that says, this had a reaction, or this got me a reward, or this was notable, do it again. And the reason we know that is that if you have people with Tourette syndrome taking part in an experimental setup where you give people random strings of 5 letters or random strings of 5 numbers, and you say to them, you will be rewarded depending on how fast you type those strings. However, some of them, and we'll tell you which ones, some of them only gain you 1 cent or 1 pence every time you do it. Some of them will gain you £1. Some of them will gain you a £5. People who are sort of neurotypical, people without Tourette syndrome anyway, tend to do slightly better on the ones that have a higher reward. You know, they'll sort of manage maybe 20% accuracy across the board, but maybe 30-40% accuracy if they know they're getting a £5 rather than a penny. People with Tourette syndrome get almost all of them right for the high reward stuff. It's kind of like being on cocaine the whole time, having Tourette. There is this sense of, you just did a brilliant thing. It basically hits exactly the same neurotransmitters as cocaine activates and says, what you're doing right now is fucking amazing, keep doing it. And even if you know it's not, even if you know that calling your girlfriend the name of your ex during sex is going to get you a knee in the balls, part of your brain is going, no, this would be a brilliant thing to do. Let's do it. Because dopamine feels great. Mm-hmm. And we don't exactly know why that would be, but we do know that some of the cures for, I think it's Parkinson's. I'm not an expert in these pathologies, but I think it's Parkinson's that also there is a dopamine pathway related issue. But if you give kids with Tourette syndrome the same medication that is used in Parkinson's, that basically quiets down those dopamine receptors and says, you know what, I don't care, I'm not going to fire, I'm not going to respond to anything by giving you that sense of reward. So it's not like you get dopamine and then you have a sense of reward. The getting of dopamine in these neurotransmitters is the sense of reward that you experience. And the drugs essentially just block those transmitters and say, nope, no dopamine for you, no sense of reward. So you have these adolescents, and people who suffer from Tourette, particularly at first onset, are almost entirely in their adolescence. And you say to them, you will experience no feelings of reward for your behavior. If you experience no feelings of reward for your behavior, you have no motivation to go out and learn something new. You have no motivation to go and perfect a skill. You have no motivation to go out and make friends or have experiences. So we take these kids, and they are, as I say, generally kids, and we say, your behavior makes me feel really uncomfortable. When you do that, I feel very, very concerned because you're doing this thing that I can't understand. Take your medication so I feel better. I think that sucks. I think that's fucking atrocious. And there is an emerging set of studies from the United States. There was a huge resistance to behavioral treatments because there was a backlash. Tourette's used to be thought of as a psychiatric illness, as something that was essentially a sort of psychological response to something rather than physiological. And so psychotherapy was very ineffectively used. The drugs quite obviously worked because they went, there's this physical neurotransmitter problem. We'll have an impact on the receptors for this neurotransmitter, and that solves the problem. But as behavioral psychology and fMRI studies have started to go hand in hand, we realize that actually the brain remains fairly plastic, and if you change people's behavior, you also then change the receptivity of these centers and how much of these neurotransmitters are released. That there's a new treatment, behavioral intervention for tick elimination, I think it's called something like BITE, and it has proven to be incredibly effective. And it has various things, like, for example, educating teachers and parents to positively reward their kids for not ticking, for being in a situation that they find stressful and managing to do something other than their tick. It trains the kids to do something that's physically incompatible with the tics. So if it's hair pulling, do something else. Pick up some knitting needles, clap your hands 3 times, but don't do the thing that will damage you. Far bigger problem than swearing for a lot of people with Tourette's is the physical damage, the muscle damage of repeatedly using a muscle group violently in the same way over and over again. And that by enabling those kids to use the brain's own plasticity and the ability to change the way that it processes reward, they can still experience the positive affect of all of the experiences that you should have when you are a crazy, stupid, irresponsible teenager who's trying to work out what makes you feel good in life, because you don't have this horrible chemical block on that, but you're still able to do something about the tics that are most damaging for you. And one of the most important things about this new therapeutic approach is to sit down with the kids and say to them, which of your tics is most problematic for you? Screw anyone else. Forget what other people think about it. Forget their reactions. What bothers you most? Is it the pain of pulling your hair out or of having a muscular spasm? Is it something social? If it's something social, that's fine. But getting the kids to prioritize what they want to work on first. And that, given that it is both clinically effective and focused on the patient, I think is so promising. If anyone here is from the Tourette Society or knows more about this, I'd be really keen to talk more offline. Just email me or send me a tweet or something, because our conceptions about swearing in Tourette's and our discomfort around the tics that people have when they suffer from Tourette's, it's affecting the kids with Tourette's far more than it's affecting any of us who don't have it. Does that kind of...
Yep. Yes, just here. I think there's roving
roving mic.
Yep.
Hi, so I'm a mother of a very talkative toddler. So we laugh when she says the poo-poo word, which happens very frequently. But there's one word that I dread her saying, except that coincides with her surname. So her dad is Japanese, I'm Italian, and the combination of the 2 languages has very tragic effects when it comes to swearing, because my daughter not only will swear, but she will embody a swearing word, and then she'll be swearing very heavily every time she meets somebody new, especially in Italy. So I was wondering, is there any... I'm a little bit concerned, because, when we already had a bit just dropping when she proudly said her surname. I was wondering, could this have an impact on her development? Or how can I prepare it? Society, you were talking about attitude, and how could we prepare for the worst?
So what is her...
Well, don't ask.
Okay, so her surname is benign in Italian and bad in Japanese?
It's a very elegant surname, so there's no way I'm going to change it.
Yeah.
I'm allowed to change it. But in Italian, it's one of those that...
it just sounds so rude.
I think this is the best place for me to... It's the equivalent of what the fuck. So
right.
Imagine, it's it's one of those.
Dilemma.
It's not. It would not.
That is a really fascinating dilemma. I think that she is going to learn. it's probably not reassuring, but inevitably, she's going to realize that there's something about her surname that other kids she meets in Italy don't experience. And talking about that and sort of helping her understand why, it's not her, and there's nothing wrong with her surname, and that there are probably Italians who, if they went to Japan and introduced themselves, would make the jaw drop. It's like,
In fact, my surname in Japanese is a word that you would never want to pronounce.
How did you two meet?
It's just only that happened that I asked for his surname just after I was in love with him. But then that would have changed after the end of the relationship, yeah.
Have you thought of creating like a portmanteau that or just any? Yeah, I mean, when we're kids, we really do notice when people are responding to certain names. So she there's no way she's not going to notice. But continuing to talk about that and why certain words have power and why it is, as you say, an elegant name in Japan, and that whether or not there is some pride attached to it. And yeah, I mean, as kids growing up, I was very, very lucky in that my name is phenomenally boring. It was sort of half the girls in my class were Emma Louise, and the other half was Sarah Jane, because I was born in 1974, and that's what we were all called. So I've never gone through that, but I do know people whose parents have lumbered them with names that honestly they should have known better. This is not a cross-cultural, just clusterfuck like you're facing. This is deliberate bad naming by parents, and yet they have grown up to be wonderful people. Sometimes with sort of slightly rocky relationships with whichever parent chose them to call them. I'm not even kidding here. Arwen Sparkle Letkerman. Hi, Arwen. Stop reading Tolkien, parents. Seriously. But yeah, people get over having names that cause them to be teased in the playground. And I guess having your daughter understand from a very early age that words have different power depending on context is definitely a positive thing to take away from that. It just, if she marries someone with a name that is staggeringly offensive in, say, Finnish or something, just don't be surprised to carry on. It's in this wonderful, globally connected world, it's going to happen. I'm just really impressed that you are both offensive in each other's countries. Yeah. That is great work. Well done.
There's no way I'm going to tell you what my surname means in Japanese.
No, that's fine. That's fine. We could just bleep it.
I have a question for you, Emma. You say that the vast majority of languages have swear words, but some don't. Is that right? Is there some that do?
No, there is this sort of belief that there is no swearing in Japanese is usually held up, so there is no swearing. But there are terms that are taboo and that are used as terms of abuse, or they're used in derogatory ways, or are used in quite forceful ways when you're among friends, but that you wouldn't use in the workplace. But they are about very different things. Although actually there is a word about sort of female genitalia that is also quite taboo in Japan. I can't remember what it is, but I do remember that there was a woman who made a casting of her own and scaled it up as a canoe, and as a piece of conceptual art was filmed herself with this sort of vagina canoe, and that she's got in loads of trouble. She makes 3D printed versions of it as well, and she calls it, it's basically like the equivalent of sort of Pussy Riot in Russia. I think it is coming from a sort of feminist place of going, just get over my vagina, guys. But that has the same effect as, whereas you had literally millions of people, not just women, marching with pink pussy hats because of Donald Trump's use of the word. And that word almost now has been, you see it written in so many bloody newspaper articles and in so many tweets that I didn't used to use the word pussy very much, but actually it's getting to the point where it's not exactly lost its effect on me, but I feel more likely to use it in circumstances like this, because I feel the word pussy has become necessary to the discourse. And it's like, it used to just feel like a very frivolous word, whereas now, it's like something that Mrs. Slocum has. Whereas, oh, sorry, yes, no, cross-cultural references.
No,
I'm very sorry.
Well, it reminded me of this other thing that we were talking about earlier, which is the reclaiming of words. So, women reclaiming pussy, or in Australia, the WOG was reclaimed by the Greek community, and they made a film called The Wog Boy, and it was like, really wonderful. So, yeah, you were telling me about that.
Yeah, so one of the, it's a question that I get a lot, and depending on how old you are, particularly in this country, you may have grown up with an Agatha Christie book that had the N-word in the title. You may have grown up with versions of a nursery rhyme that had the N-word in it. And either you have been told as an adolescent or as an adult, actually that word is really hurtful to some people, or you have known from, in my generation, you've just known growing up that that is a word that has an enormous freight of pain behind it. And then people sort of say to me, but if swearing is good for you, and if you're saying we shouldn't censor ourselves, and we shouldn't not use swearing, how come I don't get to use the N-word? And the answer is because you're not black. Because you don't know, you cannot have experienced the sensation, the literal physical sensation of having that word used against you. You can have heard it. You could even potentially have used it, but you cannot have the emotional impact in your brain that someone who has had it thrown at them will sense. And there is something about reclaimed usage, and there aren't enough really in-depth studies among communities with reclaimed usage to look at what's going on in the brain, but certainly there are enough in terms of behavioral and social psychology to know what's going on societally. And it is a sign of trust, of solidarity, of saying that we have this same experience with this term. We are on level ground here with this word, whether, there's sort of the word queer, for example, and the queer community being able to say, I can, when we talk with one another, saying, I know how that feels, and I know that here, you know how that feels too. Whereas if someone yells it in the street at you, that is not a sign of solidarity. That is someone who has that they're speaking literally a different language. It's like me saying joder. Sorry, if there are Spaniards here, it is like my yelling, swearing in Spanish. It does nothing to me. Whereas the N-word for someone who is black, or someone who particularly has experienced, someone who is black who has experienced racism, my God, what are the odds? A woman who's experienced misogyny, or a gay or bisexual person who's experienced homophobia or trans misogyny, and so on and so forth. That all of these things where someone has known that their identity is something that marks them out for threat or for mistreatment, to be reminded that you have that identity and I don't, is an aggressive act. It's not an act of solidarity. To say, we share this identity is an act of solidarity, and that we haven't seen brain studies for what's actually going on when you hear different speakers or when different speakers use this in reclaimed settings. But I think that the galvanic skin response that I, as a white woman, get from hearing the N-word, I would stake my entire, fortune on the fact that my heart rate, my palms don't do anything like what happens in the reaction of a person of color, because I just cannot know what it's like to have that word used to hurt me. And no amount of trying to be empathetic is going to give me the right to say, hey, I get it, I get to use it too, because I fucking don't.
Be a fascinating study.
It would. Yeah, I was going to say, I'd quite happily make someone plunge their hands in ice water, but throwing racial slurs, not so much.
Any more questions aside? Yeah?
Regarding the physiological response to pain from swearing, is there a difference between if you say it in your head or out loud, or the volume level? Is there a difference?
I don't think that there's been a study on only thinking it rather than vocalizing it. I cannot think of one. I'll go away and find out. And if I come across one, I will tweet it. But we do know, for example, that volume and intonation do matter when you use swearing in a communicative sense. I had a fantastic interview with Janet Holmes, an Australian professor of linguistics, who was good enough to speak to me on the phone at like the 10 minutes of the day where both Australians and the Brits are awake. Yep. And she was in her office, and she was going, yeah, there's like a world of difference between saying, I can't remember what the sentence was. It was like, the fuck I will or something. It was like, and it's like, the fuck I will, or the fuck I will, or the fuck I will. And she's like, and she's talking about this, the difference in intonation, how it changes the semantics of what you're saying. And I was convinced that someone should knock on her door and go, "You're right in there." But then they're probably used to her doing it by now. But yeah, things that we do know affect whether or not it's effective are whether or not you consider it to be real swearing. So if you use a milder form or a minced oath, it just doesn't do it. And one of the things that was originally thought to have an impact, the original study seemed to suggest that if you were a prolific swearer, that there was kind of an immunity that built up, that you needed ever stronger swearing to have the same effect. So they went out and tested that hypothesis with people's reports of how often they swore, but also by measuring their live swearing. So they weren't just asking people to recall whether or not they swore a lot, because people's recollections are very shaky. So they actually measured how much people swore, and there is no dose effect. The good news is if you swear in your everyday life, it doesn't suddenly stop working as a painkiller. You don't have to chase an ever stronger hit. So that's quite a relief. But other than that, yeah, the various modulations that have been done, I've also been looking at what emotional states seem to be correlated with it. So another researcher in the same lab in Kiel has looked at the effect of playing different types of video games. So if you play video, sort of computer simulation of golf, which induces an emotional state of, I think, extreme tedium. That does nothing for pain relief, whereas a first-person shooter does an awful lot for pain relief. But we also know that emotion-based studies are really tricky, because emotions are not single notes, they are chords. And there is a guy who did loads of, and I was fascinated, and I was following this, and he's going, fear. Fear makes you, we know that fear and the anticipation of pain is strongly correlated by how much pain you'll feel. So we're going to make people fearful in the lab, and then they'll think this thing is more painful. Oh, they think it's less painful, that's weird. All right, we're going to make them fearful by saying we're going to shock them. No, they're still saying it's less painful. Okay, we're going to make them fearful by actually shocking them. No, it makes it less painful. Okay, we're going to make them fearful. And they came up with all of these manipulations to try to induce fear, and none of them worked to increase their sensitivity to pain. And then there is a kind of a side note in one of his later papers on a slightly different topic, where he says, we previously did work trying to induce fear states in experimental subjects in our laboratory, but found out later that when inducing fear states, it is usually the case that you induce a state of anger as well. And it's like, right. So when you say to someone, I'm going to shock you, that, yeah, not only do they feel fear, but they're also like, why did I come here today, you bastard? And that sense of aggression may be part of what's going on with the swearing. And so that kind of intonation of, you're not just saying shit in a kind of observatory way. It's like, shit you fucking cold water, which you're not allowed to do. You're only allowed one word. Brian Blessed did it wrong on the BBC. I keep going on. Stephen Fry may have done this, but he didn't set up the experimental conditions correctly. He may be a national treasure, but he knows nothing about experimental rigor. So we know various things, but not intonation, not volume so much with pain killing. It would be an interesting one to follow up with.
I might do. Maybe someone towards the back. If you can. Okay. If you can.
Do you reckon the etymology of the words that we use, like the swear words, is the reason why we consider them to be derogatory today?
So you mean things like, is the fact that something is about a part of the body or whatever, that
like the way, like in the old, like the word, like the F word. Like the fact that now we consider it to be connoted with like sex or whatever, and that's why we consider it to be derogatory, because now it's like that. But do you reckon that throughout the course of history it's become like that, or throughout like when it was first created, that's what it meant?
Yeah, I mean, like the C word, for example, was common parlance for a vagina until, this is where I need the historians. I can't remember when it falls out of favour, and it's not just the etymology of it; it's the sign of who is a dominant social group in a lot of cases. So it is a myth that four-letter words are all, at good Anglo-Saxon things, and unfortunately that's a bit of a myth. But there is definitely something to do with what language is considered polite, and things that are not polite are more likely to end up in the swearing lexicon. But it's the same way that we don't, for example, hand someone a burger and go, there's your, well, unless you're being coarse like me, but there's your piece of cow. There's your nice bit of cow there. We use beef because of the importing of Norman French. But it's not just that it was Norman French and that the Norman French were very fashionable and very fancy, and so one would say boeuf because one wanted to be like the posh new Norman French. It's also partly because it was euphemistic. It distanced you from the farmyard. And there's something about possibly even the number of syllables in the word vagina versus the word cunt that allows you to kind of take more of a linguistic run-up. But when you study it's sort of going, it's a vagina. Whereas cunt is just out there, as it were. It's not. Thank you. So, yeah, it is very hard to trace why different words have become swear words. There is always a social consensus, not necessarily at a national level, but within a class, within a social group, as to what is considered rude. You did mention that there are some Australian things that you don't tend to think of as swearing, that some of your British colleagues just go, never say to an American, can I bum a fag off you? I just don't. So we know it can't be about just the sounds. It has to have something to do with the semantics and also something to do with the social values. But I think each individual set of strong words has gained its strength, has gained its potency in a slightly different way, and that it's always reflective of different values. So, for example, blasphemies and curses were very much about this idea that words would have literal power to make something happen. And that in countries that have higher rates of religiosity, and particularly in countries with Catholic backgrounds, curses are still much more effective because of this belief in the power of intercessionary prayer. If I can pray to the saints if I pray to Saint Christopher to find my lost keys, why can't I just, wish that you get 1,000 boils? Saying things makes them happen. So that's another way that isn't purely etymological. It's to do with an idea of how language works, but you're right in that you cannot divorce the fact that this is swearing from its kind of the linguistic soil in which it grows up, if that sort of makes sense.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left, so it'd be nice to get a few questions quickly answered. So, with this gentleman here. Yep.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to bring up the subject of you mustn't swear in front of a lady. Why is that? It's supposed to be something more hurtful in front of her.
Richard Sodding Alistry, the lady's calling. Until that point, literally, women were not considered to have these sort of more delicate sensibilities. And one of the lines that I actually sent to my editor, and I was like, "Can I write this?" The second I wrote it was, "It is bizarre that from about the 1600s onwards, there was this belief that women's minds could be kept pure of particularly bodily functions, and the language that that goes with that. When, and I was very mindful of this because I was heavily pregnant at the time, we are the ones that give birth, so we know about fucking shit and bloody cunts. I mean, there is no way, as a woman who goes on to have a child, that you can avoid these things. And yet, we were supposed to be refined. And some of that is about reproductive prerogative. This idea that if you are marrying in order to reproduce, and oh God, there's a great historian that writes about courtly love and the difference between love in medieval times, love in a married state and sex, and particularly sex in the upper versus lower classes. But this is it comes down through courtly love and then through the Richard Alistry, who is the chaplain to the king. This idea that there are ladies who know nothing of the course of things in life, and then there are women, and that women are usually women of negotiable affection, and that he also talks about the fact that it's necessary that those women exist, because men are prone to sin. And it's better that they go off and be sinful with these kind of fallen women rather than with the nice ladies. So he's divided womanhood into the deserving and the undeserving as well. And the way of showing that you're deserving is by not knowing the swear words. And he also writes about women going to see restoration comedies. And he can't understand this. So later on, he's writing about, there are these bawdy comedies being played now, that the Master of the Revels has either been disbanded or has changed the rules, and you can even have women acting on stage, and you can have scenes of love and passion. And he says, it is bizarre that these ladies are going to pay money to see these things that must be so offensive to them as ladies because they are delicate. And he talks himself into this conclusion in this essay that the only reason that the ladies must be going to see these scenes of passion and of things like kissing and naughtiness is that they are so refined that they don't actually understand what's going on stage. So, yeah, the fact that there was not a single woman in the room who didn't laugh at that shows quite how out of touch Richard Alistry was. But it has been a kind of a wishful thinking sort of drive behind men for a long time of this idea that you could tell whether or not a woman was sort of good marriage material and likely to be faithful and likely to be a devoted and obedient wife based on the kind of things that she knew about, which made for a lot of shocks and disappointments when people actually got married. So yeah, I'm all for the frankness that came about sort of from the 1960s and 70s onwards, and people talking about female desire and female bodies and reproductive things, because it didn't just liberate women, it liberated men too. To be able to have a frank conversation with your life partner about what it is that you want, not just in the bedroom, but in general, on equal terms, to be able to express the full gamut of emotions, to believe that you are genuinely able to speak the same language as the person that you're married to, is an incredibly powerful thing.
Okay, we've probably got time for one more question.
Are there any studies about the connection between gender of the language? We've got languages with no gender, like UK, 2 genders, like French, 3 genders, like German or Polish, and the swear words. In French, con for a cunt is basically masculine. So.
Oh, I don't know of any studies on that. That's fascinating. If anybody knew about this, I think it would be a researcher called Jean-Marc Dewale, I think you say his name, so Dewale. And I think I'm seeing him tomorrow. I'll ask him and tweet if I find out. But I do not know whether or not sort of derogatory terms about a gender are always opposite gendered. I really don't know. Is there any speakers of other sort of gendered languages that What is your experience?
Yes, so there is usually the use of a word is to the other gender.
Huh, which language is that you speak?
Arabic.
Arabic, interesting. So gendered slurs about women are male, male linguistically gendered, and gendered slurs about men are female linguistic. That's really fascinating. I wonder if this has something to do with this idea of, it not being appropriate to be gender transgressive that was mentioned earlier. But yeah, I mean, that just, has anyone got, a grant to study, comparative linguistics? God damn it, that's a damn good question. Yeah, that's fascinating. And what that might reveal about how we relate to one another across the genders is, it's a really interesting question. I'm afraid I don't know the answer to it, but I'm fascinated by it as a question.
Absolutely, and it shows just the depth and breadth and the amount of things that are in this topic. So I'm really sorry, I know there was a lot of questions that we didn't get time to answer, but Emma's outside signing books, and she's got lots of lovely pencils for anyone that are really fun and colourful. So hopefully you can ask her some questions outside. But thank you all for coming, and thank you, Emma, so much for the presentation.
Thank you. And thank you, Jancy!
Yes, and to dancing.